Alan and Sean here from the Prancing Pony Podcast, welcoming you to the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
The Tolkien Experience Podcast is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community sharing their Tolkien experience.
And now we'll send you over to Sarah and Luke.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Luke Shelton.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Every other week, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any further delay, let me introduce our guest.
So I am here with James Tauber, also known as the proprietor of Digital Tolkien, a wonderful blog that he's been putting out a lot of work on recently. So it's very nice to have you here.
Thank you very much, Luke. Good to be here.
I wanted to reach out to you because I've really enjoyed meeting you at Tolkien 2019, and then also the work that you've been doing on your blog. And so it really made me curious about your history with Tolkien. And you actually already did a text-based entry for me, and I thought it would be great to share your story in an audio format as well. So why don't we go ahead and get started by diving into the first question. How were you introduced to Tolkien's work?
Well, that was a long time ago. It was certainly reading The Hobbit, and I would have been around the age of 10 or 11 at the time. I don't remember the details of how I discovered The Hobbit or was given it or whatever. At the time, I know I'd read the Narnia books. I was really big into Hugh Walter's science fiction books like Destination Mars and Journey to Jupiter. And at some point around the age of 10 or 11, I read The Hobbit. And I think it says something that's the one book that I still own, still know where it is, still remember it, still talk about it, compared to all the other books that I would have read at the time. I can date it to that time though, because I remember what happened next on my 12th birthday. That sort of continued my Tolkien journey. I was really into The Hobbit, and I was obsessed by it as a 10 or 11 year old, and my aunt knew this fact, and so for my 12th birthday, she bought me Return of the King, presumably not realizing that it was the third part of Lord of the Rings. And I immediately recognized that it was the third part of Lord of the Rings and thought, well, I can't read this, but being a 12-year-old, it's not like I could just go out and buy a copy myself. I'm not sure whether I looked at the library or whatever to see if I could get a copy of the Fellowship. But anyway, for whatever reason, I decided I couldn't read it and didn't end up reading the Fellowship. Instead, what I did was look at the appendices. I felt that was something I could at least do with Return of the King. And so I ended up studying the Lord of the Rings appendices in great detail. I was captivated by the timelines and the language, and really wanted to learn more about that kind of stuff. And for whatever reason, rather than go out and buy or borrow Fellowship of the Ring, the next Middle-earth related book that I got was Robert Foster's Complete Guide to Middle-earth. And so I think in an interesting way, I became more fascinated by the world and the world building than any particular story. And so I became obsessed with, family trees and timelines and the languages and all that kind of stuff. And then, again, at a point where you would expect me to go and seek out Fellowship of the Ring, I instead heard that there was this other book by Tolkien that was really hard even for adults to understand, namely the Silmarillion. And telling a 12-year-old me that there was a book that even adults had trouble with was the surest way to get me to be interested in reading it. So I got a copy of the Silmarillion and started reading it. Didn't get particularly far, like a lot of people seem to experience with the Silmarillion. But I became really interested in the whole creation myth around music in the Einlindale. And so during my teen years, that actually became a really big obsession of mine, was the Einlindale. And I came across the History of Middle-earth books that were coming out during this. So this was during the 80s, and they were coming out at that time. And I went to the bookstore. I distinctly remember this, going to the bookstore and looking which volumes of History of Middle-earth said something about the Einlindale. And bought any ones that talked about the Einlindale at all. So things like Shaping of Middle-earth and so on. And my goal at the time, because I was also interested in music, was actually composing something that was intended to depict the Einlindale. So in a strange roundabout way, and I did end up reading Lord of the Rings many years later. Actually, I started reading Lord of the Rings after the Peter Jackson films came out. So I have this very unusual ordering of Hobbit, Lord of the Rings appendices, Complete Guide to Middle-earth, Silmarillion, parts of History of Middle-earth, and then finally the Lord of the Rings itself. Little strange, but I'll probably say as we continue to talk, say more about the strange focus that gave me. One of the things I will say initially about that, though, is of course that completely changes how one receives the underlying mythology in Lord of the Rings. Because unlike somebody reading Lord of the Rings and wondering what this underlying mythology that's talked about all the time is, I was actually already familiar with that when I did read Lord of the Rings. So I think I took for granted just how intriguing it would have seemed to somebody that had only read Lord of the Rings and not the Silmarillion or Unfinished Tales and so on.
I mean, that's a fantastic reading history. It's one that when you submitted your text draft of this, I thought was so interesting because it is so unique. And I immediately thought about, what does that mean for, the reader of The Lord of the Rings to already have seen all of that background information, and how people of an older generation who came to the story earlier couldn't possibly have had that experience because the Silmarillion wasn't published until well after The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I find really remarkable, especially in the whole sphere of Tolkien's constructed languages, is just what it must have been like in the 70s, say, late 60s, early 70s, when Lord of the Rings was really taking off, especially in the US, and there was this real interest in the languages. What it must have been like when all you had was Lord of the Rings, and trying to piece together stuff. And Jim Allen has this amazing book that he published just before the Silmarillion came out that does an incredible job of reverse engineering language stuff just from Lord of the Rings. And obviously a lot more's come out since then, both in Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, and but also all of the work of the Elvish Linguistic Fellowship in documenting sort of the unpublished language notes of Tolkien. But yeah, it's remarkable what it must have been like, and it's something that I can never, I don't have access to because of my own history. What it would have been like when the only source of information about the underlying legendarium was the text of Lord of the Rings itself.
Yeah. The next question kind of comes from what we've been talking about, and just kind of your unique history, I'm sure, has led you to a very unique answer to what is your favorite part of Tolkien's work?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because in a way, I don't know. I don't know if this is a cause and effect or what direction the cause and effect is, but I'm very much a Lang person rather than a lit person, and I've always been drawn to the paratext more than the text and the the sort of legendarium and the languages and stuff like that far more than the main story. And I don't know if that's simply because of the order that I read things, or if my acceptance of that ordering is because I sort of had that underlying preference to start with. But certainly, I mean, the things that have always stood out for me with Tolkien are the language stuff. And I'll say more about that in a moment, because I've come to appreciate that even more over time as I became a linguist and philologist myself. But certainly right from day one, the language stuff, but also just the sheer depth of the mythology. And, this often gets remarked about in the context of Tolkien, of just how rich the mythology is. And certainly for a reader of Lord of the Rings who isn't familiar with all the background stuff, I think that they probably don't realize that so much of that depth was achieved because so much had been done and written and thought about long before Lord of the Rings was published. I sometimes imagine what it would be like if an aspiring fantasy writer asked, what do I do to write like Tolkien? And you had to tell them, well, spend 30, 40 years of your life working on the Legendarium, and then only after you've done that, write a story that's set 6,000 years later. There's just such an incredible, that leads to such an incredible result, I think, because it's not that, I think it would have been a very different situation had Tolkien planned the First Age deliberately as the backing to the story he planned to write, right? If he'd said, I want to write Lord of the Rings, but before I do that, I'm going to do a bit of world building and sort of mythology, I don't think we would have got anywhere near the depth. It's really only because he poured his heart and soul into the Legendarium, and then later wrote a story that drew from it, that enabled that kind of almost iceberg-like effect with 10% above the surface, and so much of it hidden. So that's the other thing that really stands out to me, besides the language work, is just the depth, and therefore realism to me of the mythology.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible. Of this whole past experience that you've shared, what do you think is your most fond experience of Tolkien's work? Which one reading or one experience of the work?
I think there's been a couple of occasions that have really stood out for me. Certainly that initial experience of seeing the appendices and looking at the language stuff in particular, studying the Tengwar, and really realizing that there was this way of thinking about the sounds in a language that was systematic, that there were patterns to sounds that could be represented in the way that you wrote the letters, that really had a huge impact on me and stuck with me all the way through studying linguistics many years later. The other thing that I do, much more recent, that I do fondly remember, is just that realization. And again, this is unusual for me because of the order in which I read it, but the realization of just how many allusions there are to the First Age in Lord of the Rings. There's this sort of knowing smile, I guess, that crept across my face the first time that I was reading Lord of the Rings and realized just how much it was alluding to things that happened on Valinor or places in Valinor and so on. Sometimes they would be explicitly named, like in Lord of the Rings, there would be numerous mentions of Valar and so on. But sometimes it was much more of an allusion to a place in the West or something, and it was just, I don't know, it was sort of a confirmation of that whole depth of the mythology, that I thought, Tolkien's not being too on the nose about it. He's not. It's not like he had this setup and then payoff at the end. he's woven this mythology as a thread through the story in ways that are subtle enough that it gives a hint of that, the realism and depth of the mythology, without it being this deliberately worked out world building like you would normally get in a novel. As I said, if you'd done it deliberately for the purposes of writing Lord of the Rings. And just sort of that realization as I'm reading Lord of the Rings of just how he did that was a real delight. I guess the other thing, just saying this, I thought of a third example, which was coming back to The Hobbit after studying. So, I read The Hobbit probably 35 years ago for the first time, but rereading it last year, having studied Old Norse and Old Norse sagas for the first time, was also a delightful experience, realizing just how much, even in The Hobbit, just how much he was drawing on certain tropes and so on in Old Norse, like the whole approach to The Hobbit, some of the humor, even just ideas of dragons sleeping on piles of gold, and all of that kind of stuff just draws so much on Old Norse mythology that I'd never really appreciated until I had read the Old Norse sagas and then went back and read The Hobbit. So that was definitely another moment that brought a smile to my face.
Yeah, you actually kind of anticipated our next question when you started talking about the way that you revisited The Hobbit and kind of interpreted it in a new way. Our next question was, how has the way that you've approached Tolkien's work changed over time? So that's a pretty good example of that. But can you think of any other ways that your approach to Tolkien has changed?
Yeah, I think, certainly that's a good example, but even more broadly, I think I appreciate even more now the extent of the sort of philological input that Tolkien put into it. When I first read The Hobbit and then was just trying to read the Silmarillion and so on, I didn't know much about linguistics, and I'd not really studied any sort of Germanic philology or anything like that. And coming back now, I realize again this sort of goes back to what makes Tolkien so remarkable and unique, beyond simply the sheer amount of time that he spent working on this, is just the background that he had and the extent to which that pervades everything that he did. The care that he took in naming things, and just the richness that exists in place names and so on, is something that when I first started to get interested in the constructed languages, you pick up little things of, this particular root means this, or this particular ending tends to mean this, and so on. And that was sort of interesting from a language point of view. But I really started appreciating a lot more in the last few years just how central that process was for Tolkien of coming up with history to the names of particularly places, to a lesser extent people, but certainly places. That sort of rich notion of this place was named at this time in this context, and so draws from particular linguistic elements that would have meant certain things at that particular time. That's really one of the things that shifted. The other thing that has, and this sort of relates to what I'm trying to do with digital Tolkien as well, is I always kind of knew that in some senses Tolkien's works were in a different class, more akin to sort of ancient texts than the typical 20th century novel. But it was only in the last couple of years that I've really thought about pursuing the study of the texts accordingly. It's one thing to say, the depth of the mythology or whatever reminds me of Homer or the Old Testament or something like that. But the next step after that, which is a fairly new thing for me in the last couple of years, is saying, well, okay, then how do we, if that's true, if we do acknowledge that there's certain characteristics of the text that put it in that category, then how does that change the way we actually approach it? and that's sort of what led me down the path of saying, well, as somebody that in my pursuits outside of Tolkien, I do a lot of work with historical language texts in ancient Greek and in particular, where I adopt certain digital techniques to studying those texts. Well, why not do the same for Tolkien? Because they do, as I said in my talk at Tolkien 2009, Tolkien was not just a philologist, but a creator of works worthy of philological study. And that sort of philological study is, I think, a fairly new thing for me that's only happened in the last year or two.
Yeah, and I think that kind of transitions nicely into one of our last questions, which is, you've mentioned digital Tolkien a couple times now. Why don't you kind of explain what you're doing there and why you feel drawn to do it?
Yeah. So my background academically was initially as a linguist, but I was always specifically interested in ancient Greek and in New Testament Greek. And so even though I was mostly learning about languages in general and sort of characteristics of lots of the world's languages now, a little bit of historical linguistics as well, I was ultimately interested in applying that to the study of language found in ancient texts in historical languages. And one of the things that was interesting about that for me was that unlike my fellow students who could go and talk to native speakers of a particular, say, Indigenous Aboriginal Australian language, I couldn't talk to a native speaker of ancient Greek. All I could do was look at the text to see what patterns I could find. And because I was really interested in computers as well, that led itself to sort of a computational analysis. And I ended up doing a lot of work with using computers to analyze Greek texts. And I ended up then becoming a professional software developer, but maintained that interest in ancient Greek. And I went back a few years ago and actually did a classical Greek diploma and then Germanic philology certificate at Signum University, and started getting more and more back into using computers to study those kinds of texts. And I now work on projects like the Perseus Digital Library that anyone who's done Greek or Latin is probably familiar with it at some level. And it was that kind of work on using computers to study those texts combined with the realization I mentioned before of Tolkien's works being worthy of philological study that really drew me to make that connection. Well, if Tolkien's works are worthy of philological study, and one approach to philological study that I involved in is sort of a digital approach, computational analysis, what if you combine those two things and do a sort of a digital approach to the works of Tolkien? And that's really what ultimately led to the digital Tolkien project. There's a lot of stuff that's been done, I would say, more focused on providing information for fans and interested people. I'm trying to take a step back and say, from a scholarly point of view, drawing on the way that we do digital classics and digital philology, how do we apply that to Tolkien? And that's a lot more of a slow, meticulous process of working out things like referencing schemes into text, or exactly what it means for to be a name in a text, and how do you reference names, and how do you structure texts, and particularly interesting things like letters or inscriptions and things like that are mentioned in the text. How do you represent those electronically? Sorting out some of those really fundamental issues. And the history of the text, how the text has changed over time, how different drafts of the text come together to form the final text. These are all things that get studied a lot for much older works, and I'm really interested in now applying those same sorts of techniques to Tolkien, both from the point of view of, I think it's interesting to people who are doing digital philology and digital classics to see it applied to other texts, but also just to facilitate Tolkien scholarship. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a Tolkien scholar, but I'm hoping that the work that I'm doing with the Digital Tolkien Project will facilitate certain kinds of Tolkien scholarship by providing tools and so on for those scholars that want to make use of them.
Excellent. So let me just go ahead and clarify. I think you're a Tolkien scholar. Unfortunately, we are a little bit pressed for time, so I'm just going to have to go ahead and ask you the last question that I have for you, which is, would you ever recommend Tolkien's work, and why or why not?
Well, I mean, I certainly would recommend Tolkien's work. I think I wouldn't necessarily recommend people read it in the order that I did. I certainly have no hesitation in suggesting The Hobbit as a wonderful book for, depending on whether it's being read to you or you're reading it yourself. Certainly anywhere from sort of 6 or 7 if it's being read to you, 10 or 11 if you're reading it yourself, say, onwards. It's a wonderful place to start. And certainly Lord of the Rings as well. I would have no hesitation in recommending. I think it takes a person of a particular inclination to really get into something like the Silmarillion. But if you are interested in that kind of epic literature and mythology, then the Silmarillion is also a remarkable book. But I would not recommend people read it before they read Lord of the Rings, despite having done that myself.
James, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your unique and wonderful experience of Tolkien with us.
Thank you very much, Luke.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favorite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronLPalmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.